Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second part of the talks on what is neoliberalism and how does it relate to development. Today, I'm going to try to make the focus much more on the so-called global south, and I will explain those quote marks as we go on. And it's quite complex and quite difficult, but I'm sure you're all extremely capable in coping with those ideas. So we will proceed to share the slides and move to the presentation. Right, welcome everyone. So going straight into the first slide, this is divided up into sections. The first part explains what we mean by neoliberalism. The second part looks at some of the consequences of that for the global south. Then I explain about what is wrong with development in terms of how it misunderstands much of the world. And then we finish off with some comments around the problem of markets and climate change. So that's the rough structure. The slides will be available afterwards, and of course, also the recording. So key factors in neoliberal capitalism. Remember, one of the points I made last time is that neoliberalism is a flavor of capitalism, and I'll be emphasizing at least the distinction between that and welfare capitalism later. So it's important that neoliberalism isn't the same as capitalism. It's a type of capitalism. And I'm sorry the print is so small. I hope you can see it all right. These are some of the key factors in it. One is the reduction of regulation. And last time we saw how that had affected very real world things like the Grenfell Tower disaster in London, the crash of Boeing jets a few years ago because of the reduction of the oversight of the regulatory regimes and the cozy relationship between the regulators who are supposed to make sure safety is implemented and the government and business, and that kind of circle of self-interest. This led to the argument about the bonfire of the red tape. Those who don't know red tape, the British legal and civil service used to wrap files in red tape, and it became symbolic with bureaucracy and constraint. So in Britain, it's a very common way of describing the need to end red tape by having a bonfire of it to end the interference of government in business, and the nanny state, which I'll come on to in a minute. There's an ideological preference for the private sector, very, very strong indeed. A desire for reduced state spending. In fact, the rolling back of the state to the so-called small state, shrinking government, especially around welfare spending, because part of the argument of people who support neoliberalism is that they think if you're poor, it's your own fault. It's not caused by a system. And this is a major dividing line in ideology, especially in the United States, but not only, is that poverty is caused by laziness rather than systemic. And this is a very important point about the understanding of how systems work. And if something isn't privatized, then you privatize it. You denationalize it, you corporatize it in order to bring it under the influence of the private sector, because that will make it more efficient. The argument goes they will become much more efficient if they're privately owned with those incentives. So that has happened in many countries to the utilities, water, gas, transport, education, prisons, privately owned prisons, in a few in Britain, but a lot in the United States. And the forensic and probation services in Britain scandalously were privatized, leading to lots and lots of mistakes and harms. It also leads to these buzzwords of PPP and private finance initiatives, which I talked a bit about last time. So this is where the private sector takes control of a state activity, a previously public activity, in order to earn profits from it. It also means outsourcing, for example, cleaning or catering and care services, And so typically in Britain, what happened probably 30 years ago, if you were regarded as needing assistance from the state to help look after you, you would get a voucher, which you could spend with different providers. And at the same time, the carers became deprofessionalized, and terrible things were and still are happening with those services. One of the points about outsourcing, because last time I mentioned the occupation of the university here in Sussex 10 years ago, when the catering and the cleaning services were outsourced to private companies, the students protested about this because it means that it's hard, worse contracts, worse labor contracts, harder work for the workers, no proper pensions and rights like that. And the occupation happened 10 years ago against that. Now, what has happened with neoliberal implementation, certainly in Britain, is it's happened bit by bit. So you don't know it's happened. I mean, none of you will know that those services are privatized and that they used to be part of the university function. They used to be proper university employees who operated on the basis of the well-being of the students and the staff at the university. So this kind of means that it is normalized, and it seems right. Well, why would you change it? Because it's normal. We can eat. The toilets are cleaned. It becomes something which it's a much harder struggle to go back to it because it becomes normalized. We also know that the neoliberal argument is about the worship of the market at all costs. Everything should be marketized and privatized and supposedly subject to competition. But we also know that this is fake because, well, I'll come back to that later on. There is a diminishing of competition rather than an increase of competition under neoliberalism. And this probably is quite important for you. Everything is around tendering for contracts. I don't know if you're aware, but IDS gets no money from the government. Every single bit of money, apart from your fees, which are a relatively small part of IDS's income, all the staff are hustling away to tender for contracts with those who are providing so-called aid. And that is a major, major hassle. And we work here, we spend an enormous amount of time trying to get funding for different kinds of projects. And because everyone is desperate to get their income, we're often actually tendering for things where we might be doubtful about whether it's actually going to help people, because the funding is, I mean, just 3 weeks ago, something came round to staff saying we could tender for this project in partnership with EY, the Ernst Young, the so-called accountancy company, and with a major Unilever, a major global corporation, to work on food security. Now, what those two companies bring to the idea of understanding people's lives and food systems is very doubtful. And so this is the danger, that you get into bed with companies and do things which are actually against the morals, the ethics of IDS. League tables are our favorite thing of neoliberalism. Competition between institutions. So instead of you hoping that the school that your children will go to will be a good school locally, parents have to fight to get their children into the school that they might want, or the best hospital. So these league tables, a lot of them are manipulated and are not very useful. It also means something called the Washington Consensus, which I'll come back to. And this is especially important in how these ideologies have been enforced, literally enforced, on the countries in the global south. Structural adjustment policies for the 80s and 90s. And this is the point I made earlier, that the changes are incremental. So it's difficult to see that we are now extremely different from what it was in 1980. In that period of 45 years, how the economy has changed towards neoliberalism is extremely difficult for younger people to detect, because it's just the norm. It's what is expected. And I think it's important to understand that belief in neoliberalism is ideological. It's almost like a faith. It defies logic in many cases. And I'll be explaining some of those cases as we go on. Okay. Kieran, is the way to move the bar from the bottom of the screen there? We'll live with that. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay. And this is one of the most important aspects of it is low taxes for corporations and the rich or individuals, and the argument that inequality is important for economic growth. And if we promote economic growth, then everyone will benefit. You know, all ships rise in the harbor, and so on. So these are very powerful arguments around this. Sorry. I thought I'd turned it off. It's a new phone and I don't know how to turn off the sound. Obviously, hopeless old person in the room. Okay, so, and we will come back to the tax issue later on. Oh. Here's the nanny state. If you're from a country where this phrase is not used. So this is at the height of the COVID epidemic, and this government minister, just leave you for a minute to read it. And this is really important for neoliberalism, is that it sells itself as being about individual freedom. And we talked about in the part one, that it's linked up with institutions who argue in favor of the policies and the ideology because it gives individuals freedom. And we all want freedom. So it's a key part of this and how it's linked up to the populist agenda, which in many cases is supported by those who want neoliberalism. And this book came out some years ago. I know you can't read that. This is the United States. How food fascists, teetotaling do-gooders, etc., turned America into a nation of children, nannying them, okay? And this is in Britain. This is in 2004. Notice that the foreword is written by Boris Johnson, who was an MP at that time. And this one says the present Labour government has introduced unprecedented amounts. I'll leave you to read it. I don't need to be a nanny and read it to you. So I hope you can see this connection now between what's happening at the macro main scale and how they are encouraging ordinary people to buy into it by saying our policy at this macro scale, at the national or international scale, is actually helping you to be free individuals at the local individual scale. That linking up of that ideology, which we talked about last time, is really important. And then this came out a few years ago, promoted by one of the most ideological institutions, the Institute of Economic Affairs, which helped to write Liz Truss's and Kwasi Kwarteng's budget in 2022 that went so wrong. This is, have you got freedom from the state telling you whether or not you can smoke or drink? So this is a very the way that the ideology of the IEA and the like ones is linked up to selling the idea that you will have your individual freedom taken away by those who support a different kind of capitalism that promotes welfare, well-being, and equality. And this came out just a couple of months ago. This is from a right-wing TV channel in Britain, the authoritarian horror. So you can see how if you deny people's individual freedom by saying that they shouldn't smoke, then it slides into this idea that that state is authoritarian, which is also why in that book it said that you know, you have eco-fascists. It becomes a way in which you can make the argument that individual freedom is about opposing an authoritarian state, but that authoritarian state is actually trying to do decent things. I doubt whether there's many people in society who think that, for example, it's right to drink alcohol and drive a car. Okay? But that was 50 years ago. That was the nanny state said you shouldn't drink and drive. It would be extremely difficult for them. So they pick on new things. That's already established in people's behavior in Britain and most of the world, is that you should not drink and drive. But that was the nanny state saying it is wrong to put people at risk by doing that. Wearing seatbelts or crash helmets or having speed limits. Okay, these people would not advocate that there should be no speed limits, although they have been against the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, which is used in many towns and cities now. And they want to reduce the restrictions on smoking. So they pick new things because these things like seatbelts and drink driving are pretty well established as something which is has to be regulated by the state telling you, no, it's bad to do it. So this brewery came up with a new beer a few years ago, which is zero alcohol. Now, of course, it's very funny. And this company, which I think is based in Edinburgh, the boss of it has actually been exposed for employing very poor employment standards. And there has been a big scandal about the company's behavior. But it's United We Stand for Better Beer, fiercely defiant and independent. So you get the feel here is about freedom, being independent, autonomous, entrepreneurial. Okay, so that's enough of the nanny state. You all understand what it means now. So in the global political economy, we have to come down to now looking at the global south, so-called, by looking at structural adjustment programs, which were very popular in the 1980s and 90s. Now, these actually constituted a set of rules supported by it's very similar to the Washington Consensus, which is called that because it's around the World Bank, which is in Washington, with the IMF, also in Washington, US government, and the WTO, which inconveniently is in Geneva, but it was called the Washington Consensus. And basically, it's a list of recommendations as to what should happen in countries of the global south. And if you didn't do this, you didn't get the loan. So this was how it was forced on governments in the global south. If you want to get a loan from the IMF or the World Bank, you have to do these things. And it's all of these things, which I won't have time to go into. They're there in the slides if you want them. And these are the things which actually, especially privatization of state enterprises, foreign direct investment liberalized, trade liberalized, et cetera, allowing much more foreign direct investment without constraints. This is the list which was forced on countries in order that they could actually get loans to deal with their balance of payments problems, the price of oil, which had gone up enormously in the 1980s, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with these SAPs, yeah? You've all heard of them. Now, of course, they had a very negative effect on people's welfare in many countries. Oh, sorry, that one is really important. Legal security for property rights. So that it wasn't at the whim of government, that it would be actually set out in law, defended by court action, where you could sue to recover your assets if you felt that they were being imposed on by a government agency, whatever. I'm going to skip that one. Here is the key thing, is that although neoliberalism makes the claim that it is about free markets, we know that the markets are not free, because the governments that support neoliberalism will also support corporations that do not want free markets. Okay, and these are the key areas where free markets don't exist. Huge bailouts after the 2008 financial crash. Tens of billions of dollars spent by the British and the American governments to bail out banks and financial institutions, and under the pretext that they were too big to fail, that the consequences of them failing would have negative effects on ordinary people. Too late for the millions, several millions of people in America who lost their homes as a result of this. Agricultural subsidies are another huge area of where there is not a market certainly in Europe and the United States. The European Union has a common agricultural policy that in 2018 gave 58 billion euros, that's around $60 billion, to to farmers. Now, when we say farmers, we don't mean somebody who's got their own little farm and so on. We mean corporations who own land and are the corporate owners of those lands who get the subsidies from the CAP. In the more up-to-date figure, that is for 6 years, that is the budget for the next 6 years. Okay, so it's still going on. US farm subsidies 4 years ago were $22 billion. And these are used in order to support, were intended in both regions to support poorer farmers, and then it became an argument to protect the environment, et cetera, et cetera. But there's no free market in agriculture. There are these heavy subsidies, which in some cases have been used to undercut imports from Africa and other parts of the world. Because and they've been argued for that. These subsidies enable American farmers to resist competition from cheaper suppliers in the global south. It's gone down in the United States because there is a lot of pressure to reduce government spending, but there is also ideological pressure to say, well, okay, if we believe in free markets, why are we still doing this? And then another huge one is fossil fuel subsidies, mainly to corporations. And these are of the order, I mean, your mind will be blown by this. Every year, some economists at the IMF estimate from pretty good research the total amount of subsidies that support fossil fuels or other practices which are harmful to the environment. And the most recent ones, each year, it's been between $4 and $5 trillion. Now, we have to divide that up, and I'm not going to have time until perhaps the end to divide that up between subsidies to corporations in the so-called global north, and the other issue is governments in the global south who use subsidies to fossil fuel because otherwise they would lose the election. So, for example, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya had a battle over this just a few months ago. So a significant proportion of those subsidies are to consumers and not to corporations. And there, roughly speaking, there is a divide between the global north and the global south. Global north, they subsidize corporations. Global south, the government subsidize consumers in order to get their votes. But it is an enormous amount, which is showing that there are not free markets. And the other one, which is the killer, there is no free market in labor. Hence, most countries of the global north have restrictions on migration. Okay, and this is quite extraordinary. Some neoliberals actually have argued that there should be a free market in labor. If we really believe in the ideology, why don't we have a free market in labor? And we can come back to that discussion later. Now, where does all this come from? Because it's called neoliberalism, which means that it's new. Neo equals new. Liberalism, we'll come to what that means. It implies that there was an old liberalism. So we need to look at the timeline a bit and see where this has come from. So economics as a discipline emerged with capitalism as a way to analyze and understand what was going on with the shift from feudalism to capitalism, where you had industrial, urbanized, an entirely new type of economy. When economics first emerged, it was called political economy, because very sensibly, those people realized that there was no economics without politics, and there was no politics without economics. Crazily, that has been separated in more recent decades. So the early research attempted to explain how wealth is created and why different places have different levels of so-called wealth. You might remember Adam Smith's book was actually called The Wealth of Nations, the short title of it, which I mentioned last time. The argument was, what are the best policies, or indeed having a lack of policies on the part of government, which will foster the economy? What is the best kind of policy or lack of policy which will do that? And here you can begin to see the emergence of the idea in liberalism, the first time round, that if the state interferes in the economy, it won't be good. So the original ideas of liberalism, or as it was called then, laissez-faire, the French phrase meaning let it happen, was that the state should have minimal impact, minimal interference in the way in which the economy operated. So you can begin to see this is where this emerges. And so this would benefit the economy, economic growth in the countries now operating in capitalism. And they thought, and this is important, that this economy is superior to the feudalism that preceded it, because it's here you have the emergence of the idea of freedoms to be an entrepreneur, because the feudal system was a very hierarchical system that made it quite difficult for new entrepreneurship to emerge. And in that hierarchy, there were protests from two sides. From the entrepreneur's side, freedom to become capitalist, and from the workers' side, the freedom to be free of constraint by that hierarchy, which we will come back to, because it's quite interesting. You get two different ideas of freedom emerging out of the same debate. So this is classical economics, as it's sometimes called, laissez-faire, also known as neoliberalism. Hence we now have, liberalism, hence we now have neoliberalism. And what happened was that this system led to quite a lot of revulsion against the extraordinarily awful conditions in which many people lived, which I'm going to show you in a few minutes. There was, of course, you could not look at what capitalism created in the cities without thinking this is appalling and awful, where children as young as 8 would be working in factories in very dangerous jobs, etc., etc. Now, what happened, interestingly, is that philanthropic capitalists, often from Protestant religious groups like the Quakers, who started up a number of industries like Rowntree's and others, they saw what was going on, and they put money into social reform around education and housing. So it's quite interesting you have this parallel in the 19th century around philanthropists taking over this role, which previously had been done by the church, by welfare through the church. But we also have the arrival of the welfare state, basically from the 1920s in Britain and in the United States. And we also have the emergence of what was called one nation capitalism or welfare capitalism, which is entirely different from liberalism and laissez-faire. Here the argument is you cannot have laissez-faire, you cannot let it be, because the upshot of that is mass poverty, appalling living conditions, suffering on a tremendous scale. So welfare capitalism, as it was also called, or democratic capitalism, or democratic, social democracy, different countries have different words for this, emerged in the 20th century, especially after the Second World War, to be the alternative to liberalism, laissez-faire, okay? But then that collapsed. And that collapsed because from 1980, what was sometimes called Reaganomics or Thatcherism became the dominant ideology in economic policy and political ideology in many Western countries. So we have that kind of full circle back to now it's called neoliberalism because it is the new emergence after the welfare capitalism of the 20th century. So the terminology is incredibly confusing. So I'm going to try to unpack it a bit here. Neo means new, liberalism, well, the word means many things to many different people, and it means different things to different people, depending if we go back to the 18th century, as Britain emerges from feudalism, is your desire for liberalism to be free of the feudal system, making it difficult for you to be a capitalist, an entrepreneur, or is it liberalism to enable you as a worker to be free of the capitalist and of the oppression of the capitalist, who has replaced the feudal lord as a capitalist lord? So the word liberal and being free has these different connotations because it depends on which class you are. And the class determines what your kind of freedom is going to be. So liberalism is class-based. Neoliberalism, new version of the 19th century, etc. So the economic approach argues that market forces should be free. Here we get free markets. The word free is pushed into it to make it appear that that makes it good into that. And the role of the state should be very restricted. And the classical economics, as you might remember, is based around the idea of this idea of economic man. An economic man makes decisions on the basis of what's good for them. They are profit-seeking or income maximizing. You all know this kind of. So the rational human being maximizes their income or their profit if they're an entrepreneur. And if everyone maximizes their own personal benefit, then that will enable the economy to be maximized for its benefit for everybody. And an ideological belief that markets can solve all problems. Well, last time I asked the question, can markets solve the problem of healthcare? Can it solve the problem of education, of hunger, of gender equity? No. None of those absolutely crucial things for people which are still not solved for most people in the global south and still not solved for many poor people in the global north. Markets cannot deal with those basic human needs. And it's really important to remember that, because nobody who supports neoliberalism ever says that. They will argue for privatizing the health service and pretend that that will enable everyone to have access to health. But by definition, it can't, because you have to pay for it and you can't afford to pay for it. So it's a nonsense. You only have to look around you to see that the market does not solve the problem of people's hunger, having enough to eat. So that's really why it's a faith. It's based around faith and not reality, because it's the assumption that markets can solve problems which they can't possibly solve. Terminology, a problem. I'm going to leave these because they will be there in the slides and it's taking a long time. But in this slide, what I try to do is explain how the word liberal became something which can be used on both the left and on the right. And basically what we have to understand is around class. Who is using it for what purpose? And this is why it's also important that the elite want to pretend that liberalism is about freedom of the individual, because they have connected up the idea of freedom for the individual with the freedom of enterprise to maximize profit. Okay, so that's the key link to the disinformation that is going on. Okay, I'm going to skip over these as well, but basically what this is saying is that what happened in the 19th century is that there was fierce class and gender and anti-imperialist struggles going on in Britain and other countries, which were arguing that the system was wrong. Anti-slavery struggles, anti-imperial struggles. People in Britain were against the Irish being colonized. They were against India being colonized. And the workers were campaigning against capitalism and supporting socialism and trade unions and votes for ordinary people that didn't have the vote. And there were struggles for the female vote, because all of the early chances of getting a vote in Britain were for men. So all of these struggles were going on against the system because the system was crap. Going to slip. You can look at these on the slides. I'm going to skip them through. This here is the wealth distribution at the beginning of the 19th century. But half the population in Britain had nothing. This is wealth. This means property. It means a house, savings in the bank, actual things which are your wealth, jewelry, a watch, a clock, nothing. Zero for half the population. The top 10% had over 90% of the wealth. In other words, the first kind of liberalism, laissez-faire, had not distributed the benefits of economic growth to everyone fairly. It was blatantly obvious. And you can see here that after Thatcherism, neoliberalism comes back, and you can see that the wealth of the rich goes up and of the poor goes down. And they never ever, the poorest 50% in Britain, never ever got above 8% of the wealth. Okay. Incidentally, because I used this slide in another lecture, this here is at the height of the British Empire. So I'm against simplistic binaries. I'm against the global north, against the global south. I'm in favor of understanding class binaries. The global or national elite, the capitalist class or the ruling elite in any country, and the mass of ordinary people in those countries. For me, that's the binary that is useful to understand. And that applies also to empire. Empires have never been, all the people in Britain said, let's go and conquer India. We think that's a really good idea. Or let's go and conquer Ireland. Wouldn't that be brilliant if Ireland was part of us? No, it's an elite who says, let's go and conquer those countries. Empires are class-based, and they're not around the idea that British people wanted to conquer those territories. This is Britain in 1900. And one of the main ways in which people got poverty relief was to go and stay in a workhouse. Workhouses housed in every town and city housed thousands of people. This is one in central London, 1911. This went on until 1930. If you couldn't manage to live, you went in and you got basic rations and you had to work. Thousands of people in this. This is one in Bath, which is quite a small city in Britain, an enormous poorhouse. This is one also in central London in 1900. Shocking, isn't it? So this is one of the ways in which welfare was distributed to the poor to make it so awful that nobody ever wanted to go to the workhouse. This was the last resort of the poor at the height of the British Empire. So it was not shared equally. And this is the income, not wealth, this is income distribution. In 1900, 50% of the people had only 15% of the wealth. The top 10% had 56% of the wealth. And as you can see with neoliberalism, the wealthy got wealthier and the poorer got poorer in terms of their share of the income. That's why we talk about increasing inequality. Okay, and that's where you can directly see the impact of neoliberal policies in increasing that inequality. This is the top, I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea of progressive rates of taxation, meaning the more you earn on each extra income you earn, you get a smaller percentage of it. Okay, so this is at the start of the 20th century, that there were no high rates of income tax. You can see that in the 1920s, they begin to tax, certainly in the United States, to pay for the New Deal, and the rates in this part of the century go up. Germany goes down much earlier than the others. And then after neoliberal policies come in, 1980, in all countries they go down. So basically what this means is that if you were earning more than the equivalent today of, let's say, £150,000 in Britain around that time, if you earned more than that, you would pay 90% of it in tax. Because the assumption was if you were earning £150,000, that was surely enough to live on. You didn't need any more. So thank you very much. The rest we will take away to pay for schools and healthcare. Okay, that was how taxation worked in order to improve the lives of ordinary people. But you can see how it came down, and the UK rate is now 45% for the top rate of tax. So you keep more than half of your wealth if you earn more than equivalent of £150,000 a year. So this is the unfairness of it. And this is, if you like, welfare capitalism, where the taxes are used to provide basic services, subsidized housing and healthcare and so on, and neoliberalism, where those rates come down. And with it also come down the rates of corporation tax. In 2010, a top rate of tax was put on in Britain that you paid half your income if you earn on the money that you earn above £150,000. If you earn anything more than that, half of it is taken in tax. And we have this strange sight of billionaires and millionaires saying, please let us pay more tax. So these are people who don't want to be philanthropists in the sense of giving their wealth in what they decide is needed. They prefer giving it in tax, so the democratic decision is made about how that should be spent on welfare, health, whatever. We can see the effects of neoliberalism here, especially in the United States, where the income inequality, so this is the percentage of all income going to the top 10%. So that's gone up now to 45% in the United States. Under liberalism before, it was higher and it went down. Under welfare capitalism, it's gone up. Meanwhile, it has gone up in the Nordic countries. You can see it went down very much in welfare capitalism there, but it has not gone up nearly as much. There is still the retention in the Nordic countries of a kind of a moral idea that fairness and equity is important for the running of society. I think you all are aware of that. Okay, so I'm going to just stop now in case anyone who has to leave for 2 o'clock has got questions or comments. Nice to stop my voice as well for you. Have a break from my voice. Any comments or questions straight away? Yes, go ahead. So, hang on, let me give you the microphone. Kieran, how do you turn it on? Are you all right with any comments being recorded now? Is that all right? If you'd rather not, then we'll turn it off. We'll turn off the recording.
This is so in India, the argument for neoliberalism is often being used as weak governance capacity or weak state capacity, because in the sense that India has a very low ratio of bureaucrats to population, and also there is an argument of being under-resourced, the government, and therefore a lot of some services are being privatized in the sense that because they're considered more efficient. So, for example, electricity services in Mumbai are now provided by this group called the Adani Group. You may have heard of them. And while you may see less power cuts, you obviously see a rise in prices of electricity, because the distribution companies in India have been notoriously known to be one of the most failing public sector enterprises. They have highest losses in the history of all public sector enterprises. And therefore, the argument is that you should privatize them because, it's just burdening the government. And similarly for other services like healthcare, education, where the government simply doesn't have the resource or the efficiency or capacity to implement that. And then there is pressure on increasing policy. So how do we debate out of that while improving government capacity and not letting privatization come in and, affecting the poor?
Okay. Are you able to stay till the end?
Yes.
Then this is the time for those who can't stay till the end.
Okay.
So we'll come back to that at the end. Is that all right? Anyone who has to leave? Anyone got to leave? No? Okay. Well, we'll come back to your point at the end. Is that all right? Okay. So what I'd like to do now is to try to begin to integrate this thinking into ideas of, we're back on recording, yeah? Into ideas of what is meant by development. And some of this, I hope, will be quite surprising, maybe even shocking for you, because I'm going to make the argument that development actually emerges obviously out of capitalism, but that in the promotion of development, in effect, it is promoting capitalism. And this is in a world where a lot of people possibly don't want capitalism and may be better off trying to find their own systems of operation. So to the extent that the way in which neoliberal forms are imposing ideas in those countries, I think there are problems. So I want to do a quick tour of the world, which you might find quite strange at this point. So here are the major indigenous peoples of the world, occupying quite large territories. Now, you will all have heard of the Australian Aborigines. You can see in the Amazon basin, that dark brown there, which is where a lot of indigenous so-called American Indians live, etc., all around the world. You can even find up in the north of Finland and Norway and Russia here, the Sami people. How many of you have heard of those reindeer herders, yeah? So you've got them all over the world. Sometimes they're called the tribal peoples or the First Nations. You've all heard of this, okay? And you all know that one of the major problems of development is how it interacts with indigenous peoples. A lot of the major conflicts in the world are where development or capitalism deals with, interacts with indigenous peoples, whether it's in the Amazon, Australia, parts of Africa, China with the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, etc., etc. So should we understand them in terms of how they operate as a system of production rather than an inconvenience? Now, the way that's been negotiated in recent years is to say they've got indigenous knowledge. They've got ways of understanding the plants and healthy plants and so on. Let's value that. Well, the pharmaceutical industry has done that and gone on research trips into the Amazon basin to find the plants in conjunction with the local people that they can then marketize and sell in the marketplace in big pharma. Okay, that's one of the ways that happens. But now there is a twist to that let's learn from those peoples about how to deal with climate change. What is their existing knowledge which can help either in those places or their guidance on how it might happen in other places? So what I'm doing is building up a patchwork of the world in which people live under entirely different non-capitalist systems. And how should capitalism and development behave with them? And prior to 10,000 years ago, everyone in the world was an indigenous person. And the vast majority of those people were hunter-gatherers. You all know this, yes? So their predominant economy was a gathering, hunting economy, livelihood, if you like. What happened What happened 10,000 years ago is, and I'm oversimplifying like crazy, is agriculture was invented. Okay? Agriculture was invented probably in about 8 different parts of the world at different times. The earliest one was in the Middle East in what is now referred to as the Fertile Crescent. Have any of you heard of that? The Fertile Crescent in modern Lebanon, Iraq, Syria. And that was where humans are supposed to have first developed crops which would be better capable of feeding people by crossbreeding. Now, all of the crops, the major crops that we use, wheat, rice, barley, oats, teff, maize, are basically wild grasses that humans thousands of years ago found ways to make them more productive and use in the fields. Okay, so humans genetically modified those plants to make them useful for human consumption. And this began about 10,000 years ago, and it came in different places like the Yangtze Valley, the Yellow River Valley, the Indus Valley, in Mexico with maize, in Peru with potatoes, et cetera, different parts of the world. Now, I'm not so interested in the population map as to show you that here, when this happened, and it's sometimes called the Neolithic agricultural revolution, that fundamentally changed the world because it created class systems in those places where this happened, which challenged the idea of hunter-gatherers. It not only created class systems, the reason it created class systems is that you had the possibility that the farmland could support more people than were farming. You don't need to farm this land here. You don't need 100 people. You only need 50 people. So the other 50 people can do something else. They might make things. They might be artisans. They might be an elite group. And so you have the beginnings of class society. You also have the expansion of urban settlements, villages, then towns. You also have the elite, which commands this by owning the land and owning slaves that they capture from neighboring peoples and women as slaves. And they command it by creating religions which keep them in control. And they create palaces, temples, which also enable them to keep control. Now, I don't have time to talk about it now, but actually my sub-theory to this is not only about class, but it's about how the elite class is taken over by psychopaths. And that is the problem that we have since farmland became private property. If you grow crops, what happened is that elite people took control and ownership of it. And basically, since then, we have the problem of private ownership under the control of elite groups, which may or may not include psychopaths who don't care about everybody else. Okay, so here's the beginnings of human life. For thousands of years, we are foraging and hunting, and probably around 10 million people still today live this way in different parts of the world as their majority livelihood. We also have common land ideas. Now, this is complex and I can't go into it in detail, but for example, much of Africa, the land was not privately owned. And the land would be over each change of generations, the land of a village would be redistributed to different families according to how large their family was. Okay, and it was the role of the chief, who was respected and by the people, to do that in a just and fair way. Now, that of course was all subverted by colonizing powers, but that was the idea. The land was commonly owned, it was not privately owned. Okay, which also gave rise in the 1970s to the idea by people like Nkrumah and others, Kaunda, to call this African socialism. And there was a very powerful idea in Africa at that time of rediscovering the collective ways in which African people had lived in what they then regarded was a kind of a form of socialism. So that was a powerful way. So common land. Now in Europe, common land existed everywhere, including around here, which the serfs, the peasants, could use for gathering firewood or grazing their cow. And what happened over a period of about 400 years until the early 19th century is that the elite captured that land and privatized it. And that was called the enclosures. I don't know if any of you have heard of the enclosure movement, which literally put fences around the land and excluded the peasants from it. Now, this was very convenient because parallel to this, industry was starting in the towns and the cities, which needed labor. So if you could no longer survive on your farmland as a peasant, then you would have to move to get a wage job in the town or the city in the factory. So this was part of the process by which capitalism emerged, and the land, which previously had been common land, not all of it, some of it, was in effect privatized. We also have land which is not privately owned, which is amongst herders, pastoralists who use grassland pasture. They're usually partly migratory, and they are probably 500 million people still today. And this is quite a significant number of people. And nowadays, people are saying, oh, we might be able to learn for climate change how to deal with dry lands or semi-arid zones by discovering how pastoralists do it in different parts of the world. So they're kind of a resource, possibly now. We also know that much of the world has what's called swidden cultivation, burnt cultivation, where it's also called slash and burn. Have any of you heard of slash and burn cultivation? It's very common in parts of Southeast Asia, parts of India and Africa. And basically you cut down, a village cuts down the forest, ash fertilizes the soil, you grow your crops, and then the soil is no longer fertile, so you move to a new place, cut down the trees again, and it's sustainable. It will continue. It is not damaging permanently damaging to the soil or the vegetation. And here again, possibly 500 million people are surviving through this mechanism in the world today. So what we're seeing is that we have a patchwork of many people using different resources for different livelihoods, none of which are conducive to neoliberalism. Well, they weren't actually conducive to ordinary capitalism either, because most of them were raided, colonized, or taken. But here we have resources that can be taken into the market by privatization, so that process intensifies. So all of these are where you could consider that land is not privately owned and is used in customary use or as common land. So really quite an important aspect of human development. And we call these different land tenure systems. But the most important ones that happen is land under private ownership, which is what you have with the development of agriculture, with farming from 10,000 years ago. You have slavery, where you need labor, so you conquer neighboring peoples and they're prisoners. You either kill the prisoners or you take them as laborers in your land. And feudalism, one of the most common forms of private ownership, was where you would have a feudal hierarchy with the king or the emperor at the top, then the lords there, and then the middle ranks, and then at the bottom, all the peasants, who basically are not free labor. This is an important point. They're not free labor. They can't move. You can't go anywhere. If you try and move, what will you do? You have no means of living. The only way you live is because the Lord gives you the right to farm that bit of land. And when you farm that land, you get a share of the crop and you give the rest to the landlord, the feudal lord, which is how they were rich enough to build huge palaces and churches in the country, and buy lots of jewelry and wealth in that sense. And then you have wage labor. So from the 19th century onwards, especially, you have the emergence of farming, where you have an owner of the land who then employs laborers on the land as wage labor. So all of these systems need labor. This category here of owner proprietors is quite significant. This is where you own the land and you farm on it. If you haven't got quite enough land, you might rent some more land, or if you've got more land than you can farm, if you've got more labor than you need to farm, then you'll hire your labor out to another farmer. So it's a mixed thing, but I did just want to acknowledge it, because it is very often the ideal that many farmers want to have. So after the Chinese Revolution went capitalist in the 1980s, the one dream that peasants had after the communes were disbanded was to be owner proprietors. They wanted to have their own land, to run their own farm in their own way. And talking of communism, this last category on the right is public ownership, public or communal ownership under a communist state. So they've almost entirely gone, although Vietnam still pretends it has communes and collective ownership. Basically, they have state ownership, and then they run it the way they want to, in that way. And they've gone more or less all over the world. The communist ways of organizing land tenure have gone. So, but basically what we have around the world is a patchwork of different ways in which people relate to the land. They conceive it as being common, not privately owned, or they know it's privately owned, but they don't own it. They have to work for somebody else on it. They have to work for a feudal lord, whatever. And the vast majority of people in the world are around here. This is probably the vast, around 2 billion people in the world who don't have freedom. They work for feudal lords or semi-feudal lords, or they work as laborers on somebody else's land. And they are the ones who are the majority of the poor, the rural poor, that development is supposed to address. Now, in how many projects have you heard of where the idea of improving people's lives, their lives by development, is changing these land tenure systems? None. It's never mentioned. So development talks about how we are going to solve the problem of inequality, not solve the problem of unequal ownership. It never, ever talks about how you might redistribute assets to enable people who don't have land or not enough land to be able to live. So I've worked a fair bit in Bangladesh, where in 1/3 of the rural households have no land at all. And when you do a development project, including the ones I've been involved in, those projects are designed around farmers and not around the landless. And these are major problems in how development defines, in all of these over here, development will define these problems as they need to be modernized. And you'll have all heard these terminologies. We've got to modernize this economy. We've got to make it more modern. Well, now with the country's leaderships espousing neoliberal policies, the form of modernization will be to hand over the rule to corporations, not to enable the people to manage their own lives. So this is the problem. This is where the 8 places where farming was invented in different parts of the world. Independently, it's highly unlikely that they knew about it. It is possible that here in the Indus Valley that they knew about this, because there was quite a lot of toing and froing there. But the other ones were probably relatively independent of one another, where they introduced these different ones in different time periods. This is shifting cultivation and slash and burn. You can see it's vast areas of the world. Okay? Now, that is not all slash and burn cultivation. That is places where it is important. How many of you have ever heard of slash and burn cultivation being discussed in the context of development and what needs to be done for development? I doubt whether any of you have. Some of you, I think, have never heard of slash and burn cultivation. In these huge areas of the world, it's really important, as is pastoralism. This is where pastoralism is in the world. Not everyone in those areas, that's where it is. And you can see it is huge areas of the world, including in Tibet, in Xinjiang, in Mongolia, in Australia. And so unless we understand these different systems of production, these different ways in which people have a livelihood, it is highly likely that what is claimed to be development will not be very sympathetic to what needs to be done for these different systems and how they interact. And a very cartoony kind of classic. So the majority of land in the world, in Asia today, in parts of Latin America, is unequally owned with an elite at the top in this very hierarchical system, with a king or an emperor at the top, with the people at the bottom either working for the lords, now mixed up with working as laborers, because it's got a bit more proletarianized. But that's the kind of the general idea. So in the 20th century, this system, which occupied a huge amount of the world, almost all of Asia and parts of Latin America, was challenged because it was the system that produced inequity, it produced poverty, it produced hunger. Okay, that system was protested at by people in different countries. So this was challenged around the slogan in many countries of land to the tiller, the farmer. Land must go to the people who actually do the farming, okay? And this was used in the Russian Revolution under the slogan of that slogan. In the Mexican Revolution, liberty or death. And in the Chinese Revolution, this is an idealized picture of the peasants getting their piece of land, the right to have a piece of land, when the landlord system was abolished. And here in the Philippines, where 9 out of 10 farmers have no land. Okay. Has anyone in your discussions about what needs to be done for development ever talked about landlessness or the problems about how revolutions emerge from unequal land ownership? We have to understand it in order to go on. Okay, so that's that a little bit. So basically the argument there, and I'm going on far too long, is that the world is a patchwork of different systems which vary according to, obviously, historical development. And in those systems, the people, in many cases, would prefer to be left to carry on living as they do. Now, the challenge there is that outsiders then say, oh, you're not washing your hands after you use the toilet. So they'll come along with a wash project. Okay, and unless you wash your hands after you've gone to the toilet, then you will have high rates of child mortality. And you will keep getting sick and you can't work because you'll get diarrhea. Or wouldn't you benefit from having vaccinations? Well, I'm not arguing against those things, but to do those things which might help improve people's lives, which they may very well want to have voluntarily, if you take into account culture and belief systems, then that doesn't mean you have to destroy their entire way of living in order that they improve their way of living. And I think, unfortunately, development and neoliberalism is around the latter option and not the former option. Now, it's 1:15, and I do want to give you time for questions and discussion. So I will have to do a third lecture, won't I? I'm so sorry. I'll see if we can organize that, because, of course, I think this is all terribly important, and I hope it's useful. But I'll now shut up and open it up for questions. We've got one already. Let's see if there's some others to come up, because if I answer your question, you're just hearing my voice again. Any other comments or questions? Yeah.
I just
should be on.
Yeah. Thank you for the lecture, Terry. I just want to know your thoughts about the efficiency argument associated with markets and private actors, because
The efficiency argument for?
Against the idea that governments are not so efficient and the private actors are.
Yeah, okay. It's quite similar in many ways. If we tag them on together, is that all right? I mean, India has more unemployed graduates than any country in the world. So the idea that there's a shortage of resource to run things, whether it's private or public, it's a misorganization of society, not a lack of resources. So the argument that the private sector will more efficiently run things is a very powerful one. But we know that when private sector does take control, it channels the wealth towards Adani or shareholders and not to the poor. And the product becomes more expensive. In Britain, the price of water has gone up and up and up. The price of electricity has gone up and up and up. And these are privatized corporations, which their profit goes to the shareholders and to their senior staff who earn millions of pounds. And they're crooked. And they keep getting caught because they're crooked. And I'm sure in India, you would find that some of the corporations are crooked as well. And so the idea about efficiency is the idea that it is impossible to make a public enterprise efficient? I think it's entirely possible. Okay, so the idea that you get rid of public enterprise because they can't be efficient and you get a private enterprise to do the same job is a false alternative. Why is it not possible to make a public enterprise efficient? Okay, and I think that would be my primary argument, that it is entirely possible to have efficient public sector issues. So then the issue would be, what kind of society generates a situation in which public enterprise is not efficient? Well, one answer would be corruption. It's not likely to be a lack of graduates. Okay, you will have all graduates you need with all the skills you might need. Okay, so you'd need to look at what is the structure of the enterprise. How does it or does it not enable the efficiency factors to emerge? So it would be around the structure of the organizational being, whether it's over bureaucratic and so on. So I think there's a false dichotomy between private and public, because it's always easy for private sector people to say the public sector is inefficient, we are the best alternative. And rather than talking about how do we make the public enterprise more efficient. So does that relate to, now, the argument that markets are wrong, I wouldn't make that argument. Markets work. They work for many things, but you can create fake markets as well. So you can create fake markets through marketing. So, for example, my niece came to visit about two or 3 months ago, and she works. She's about 30. She graduated in chemistry and marketing, and she. I said, "Oh, what's your job at the moment?" She said, "Oh, I've got a new job." She used to work for L'Oreal because she was worth it, and so. See, marketing works. You all remember that slogan, yeah? Scary, yeah? So she now works for a private capitalist venture company that is a startup, and she works in beauty. The product is called beauty, the sector of industry, beauty. Okay, and I said, well, what's your project? She said, well, next week when I go back to work on Monday, I've got to pack up 1,000 boxes of our products, our beauty products, and send them out to 1,000 influencers. And we hope that some of them will make a YouTube or an Instagram video of using our product and saying how great it is. And the target audience for these would be 13 to 25-year-olds. I'm thinking, what? This is just, I didn't, of course, say that to my niece. And she's a nice person, but she hasn't got a clue that what she's doing might be wrong. You're targeting 13-year-old girls to buy stuff. And that's what's going on. So, yes, markets work for some things. No, you can create artificial markets for crap, which is not needed by society. And that, I think, is the point. When markets are managed by capital, markets produce things which they then sell to people which they don't need, okay? Rather than producing the things that people do need. And that's the problem of how markets operate. They operate for profit and not human well-being. So I'm not against markets, but I'm against the way in which businesses are able to use markets to counter human well-being.
Thank you so much for this lecture. I wanted to follow up on your answers to the question. I think part of the reason why this argument that the public sector is more efficient has gained a lot of traction is because it's related to politics.
I mean, the private sector.
Private sector,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, sorry. Because economics and politics, they cannot be separated. They always go hand in hand. And so I think there also has to be talked about, there's also been a systematic effort to weaken the state institutions so that public sector is automatically inefficient as compared to the private sector. And then the private sector comes and said, oh, the public sector is inefficient. Well, because that's part of the package of neoliberalism. But then my actual question is about how you spoke about slash and burn agriculture. And there have been in the development space, people talking about how this is actually harmful to climate change. People have talked about this is creating more emissions. This is creating deforestation, which is a little bit exaggerated to me because a few people, creating space for agriculture is not as harmful to the forest as a big company, mining company coming and taking over.
Yep.
So I was wondering if you noticed that pattern as well, to characterize people's livelihoods as harmful to the environment.
Yeah, you go as well, and then that would be good.
Hi. Well, there is something that has always puzzled me about neoliberalism, and it has to do with the fragmentation of production networks. No, the fragmentation of production networks.
Yes.
No, in this push towards decentralizing production, offsetting costs, responsibilities, and I was wondering um, to what extent that decentralization and fragmentation of production uh, implies some sort of property redistribution, or if that's false.
I'm not familiar with what you're talking about, so if you could explain it a bit more.
For example, you have the garment industry, no? So you have many cases in which previously big factories fragmented into many home-based workshops, no? So I have the question that to what extent that decentralization implied handing over the property of machines to the subcontracted workers.
I don't recognize what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
I think the tendency would be not to distribute production to households.
Mm-hmm.
I think more likely in the opposite direction. I thought what you might be going to talk about is how global production networks or production lines fragment it between different countries. So, for example, Bangladesh is a huge exporter of garments, but the country doesn't really produce cotton in a large amount. So the raw material for making the garments has to be imported. And so the production of things globally is in different parts of the world, and then they're brought together to be made in a particular place and exported. I mean, the most prominent example is things that need microchips, computer chips, where I think it's something like 70% of the production is in Taiwan, and most of that with just 2 companies. So everyone that needs chips is reliant on those companies, and those are then supplied to the different users to make the final products, and the product is assembled in China or Taiwan or whatever, or Singapore, and then goes around the world. So I think what has happened with neoliberalism is that there is no, and this I suppose is a key point, there is no attempt to have any patriotism about your capitalism. Now, paradoxically, this is one of the things that Trump is arguing about. He's, in effect, I don't think he's used the terminology, but he's, in effect, saying that capitalism has to be patriotic. It's all in words rather than in deeds, but up until actually the 1960s, if you bought a fridge or a car in a European country, it would have been made in that country. If you bought a car in Britain, it would have been made in Britain. If you bought a radio in Italy, it would have been made in Italy. But what neoliberalism has done is to say, I have no obligation to my country. I'll make this wherever I want, and there is nothing that I need to do to keep the jobs in my country. So in terms of decentralization, I think that fragmentization and seeking the best profit wherever in the production chain you can make it happen is a feature of neoliberalism. I liked your comment, and remind me your actual question. Sorry.
Development to characterize certain livelihoods as harmful to the environment.
Oh yeah, around slash and burn. Sorry, slash and burn. What I think is very easy to pick on particular livelihoods and to make those kind of statements. And I haven't done a balance account of slash and burn, and you'd have to do it in different parts of the world in different ways. I mean, the biggest issue about carbon emissions from slash and burn is that when you burn your patch of land to grow crops, then your emissions are instant. But when you leave and it regrows, it's going to take 15, 20 years for that carbon to be reabsorbed. Now, so long as the population doesn't increase rapidly, then you've got a 15-year lag, and it's not really that big a problem compared with the big emitters like the cement industry or the steel industry or flying, whatever. So I think anything that picks on relatively poor people and blames them for climate change is really wrong.